Welcome to London Unwrapped, Sounds of a Migrant City, our year-long series exploring London's music story at King's Place, focusing on the part that outsiders and immigrants have always played in driving forward musical culture in the city, from George Frederick Handel to Jimi Hendrix, from Felix Mendelssohn to Anna Meredith. Well, I'm joined by Leanne Langley, who's a social historian of British music, specialising in the musical culture of London from 1750 to 1950. And look, Leanne, when we think about the pre-1700 period, there's a big level of patronage from the court and the church, but things start to change at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century. When and how does that status quo begin to change?
Well, a lot of the court work that was going on obviously fell back when the budget was cut, and some of those court musicians were dispersed. They were let go, partly for money saving and partly for philosophical reasons. William and Mary were the ones who I believe actually cut more or less everything back, and the date is 1690. That happens to coordinate with a consummate rise in London's mercantile strength. It is already a port city. The city was built on the River Thames. The Port of London grows in size. International trade has always been huge, but it becomes actually effective for more and more people slightly lower down in the social class scale. So there's a bourgeois culture that begins to have money to spend, and all those musicians who were let go from court and some perhaps church positions realized they needed to fend for themselves. So there had always been street musicians, or people that we would call ordinary players, for instance, in taverns and pubs, but also people who played as amateurs and got together in gentlemanly groups or social groups in the neighborhood, or so that there were plenty of skilled players. There were also waits, and some of them had to find new work. I don't think the music ever stopped. It just migrates itself into different social settings. So once you have money flowing in and traditional positions closed, you need inventiveness on the part of musicians seeking work. I mean, there had always been court musicians who ceded roles to visiting stars from abroad. All the way through the 18th and 19th century, you've got visitors coming in to play for the monarch or to do a star performance. People from Handel to J.C. Bach and Mozart, Haydn, Rossini, Mendelssohn, all the way through, they are more than happy to appear at court or do the favor or the will of the monarch, but there's not really a culture going on inside the court. In fact, quite the opposite. Unfortunately, some of the royal family were not particularly interested, even in good foreign music. And so musicians didn't wait, they kept putting on things themselves. So that leads to looking for patrons. Aristocrats didn't disappear. They also wanted in their private homes, big houses, not quite like Esterhazy that Haydn lived in Austro-Hungary, but big houses, and they sought foreign young people to come and learn in England and also provide music in the house. Clementi was sent by his own Roman father to go to London to learn to play and understand how to write music, not far from me, up in Hampshire in that way, for a few years. He decided to come back and stay, but also public concerts become really important, starting unbelievably, you might think, in the city, in tavern and pub culture, but also there's a lot of money in the city for patrons who wouldn't call themselves aristocrats, except that they had money, the nouveau riche almost of the 18th century, who decide, let's get together and play this new guy called Mozart. I think he has some operas. So they would put on half-staged performances, and some of the music migrated into concert settings supported by bankers, really. And there were Jewish merchant bankers in that culture. Eventually, this quite quickly begins to migrate west into what we now call the West End or Westminster. London always lacks what I call an urban center. It's two cities. It's the City of London and it's Westminster. And those two roles set up different cultures completely, but there are Fleet Street almost connects them one to the other, and then eventually Oxford Street connects them. And so shopping becomes really important at that stage.
How I mean, how unique is this in 18th century culture in terms of the rest of Europe, possibly even America, in terms of having this combination, or this combination of an entrepreneurialism in which the musicians at least support one another, albeit there isn't much other support, but nonetheless that there is a scene that starts to thrive, and there is a middle class who are able to pay for it, and there is a kind of relatively uncensored kinds of musical entertainment that a public can pay to see. I mean, how unique how unique is that in a sort of global context for the late 18th century, 19th century?
I think it is. I think London is particularly prolific. I can't speak for Paris or Vienna or Berlin or St. Petersburg or even New York. I think London is a leader, and it's a center drawing. It's not only porous to outside visitors, it's absolutely a magnet. And the idea, it passes around that London streets are paved with gold. I mean, if you can just get to London, whoever you are, if you have talent and a nose for business, you'll do well, or you at least have a chance. So
and of course, then there are many stories of what happens to stars that fade. Cuzzoni, the soprano who ends up in poverty. George Bridgetower, for whom the so-called Kreutzer Sonata of Beethoven was written, dies in Peckham, not very far from me, in 1860 in poverty, having been hugely important as a teacher and publisher of manuals for keyboard manuals, and being a really key part of the musical scene. I mean, it shows just two stories, but there are so many more, Leanne, of careers that have a gilded moment here in London, but then, you know, because of that same mercantilism that allows it all to happen, once that isn't there for whatever reason, you know, the support is not forthcoming.
That's absolutely right. And it's tragic. There are some tragic stories, many more stories like that than success stories. Part of the problem is that it's just incessant, that you have to keep something going and continually reinvent what it is that you do. Also, some of the kinds of music, Cuzzoni's situation is she's demanding such high fees. That's one of the reasons why Italian opera had such a difficult time being established for ordinary people. To put on an operatic production is just massively complex and expensive and involves a lot of people. This is where Handel's idea of a pivot comes to the fore when we think, how smart was he? I mean, he senses from having lived and struggled, he never really, I want to say he never really made it as an opera composer, although he left fabulous music that is absolutely worth hearing and studying and listening to and should be popular. But we have to come back to it having done the oratorios first. And it's very much the same composing style, but he's clever enough to think, what's wrong with the way we're doing this production-wise in London, and how can I improve that? His sensibility was, if I can do something that utilizes a large space so that you can have enough people in the building, in other words, a theater, but don't use the expense of producing the thing. You don't need costumes. You don't need theatrical accoutrements. You just have people standing and singing. So it's unstaged. You use the same dramatic techniques as you would in opera, but you focus more on the group singing rather than the soloist. Then you don't have to pay some fantastically expensive star from Venice to come and pull in your buyers. The piece itself pulls in the buyers. Also, this brilliant idea, take it out of Italian, put it into English. Also, use the stories that the ordinary person who is, I wouldn't say working class necessarily yet, but middle class people who knew their Bible, Protestants. Some of them wouldn't be caught dead walking in a theater. But especially at Lent, here's his other brilliant idea. If you put these things on at Lent, you get around all the restrictions of we don't have stage works in Lent. He's got a dramatic piece, but it's on a sacred subject. It's called English Oratorio. So effectively, he invents a new genre, which takes off because people want to hear it. He figures out when to put it in the season, and he experiments. He's continually experimenting with the relationship of the chorus to the dramatic structure.
Is there a link there, Leanne? The repertoire that Handel establishes there, a way of thinking, a way of doing as well. I mean, these are immediately made not only for people to listen to, but for people to sing. I mean, to be part of. And then thinking about how the oratorio tradition in part inspires Mendelssohn and then Dvorak, not only in London but also in Birmingham and in the rest of Britain throughout the 19th century. The choral tradition, the participatory traditions that go through choral music in the 19th century. I suppose there's a link there too, Leanne, with the establishment of the proms and the idea of not choral music in that case, but the idea of a music, concert season made for the people, to be as accessible as possible. How important is that amateur music making and amateur love for music in terms of establishing the London's musical culture throughout the 19th century and indeed into the 20th century too?
Oh, it's central, absolutely central, especially when you think about publishing, music publishers. Novello is one. He's a second generation Italian immigrant, Vincent Novello, who works out that Church's music is not very good. We need to improve that. So he starts with Mozart and Haydn masses, which would never have been done in England if he hadn't sort of set them and arranged them in singable versions. But also the Handel oratorio tradition, which is not only something that motivates Mendelssohn, it's absolutely de rigueur. I mean, you have to do it if you come to London. And in fact, every British composer, some of them not too good that we don't need to talk about, still had to write an oratorio as a calling card. It becomes a sort of, you will not get a publisher if you don't write an oratorio first. Then the choral festivals realize they have to commission that in order to put this young composer who they have hopes in on the map. It's almost so successful, the English oratorio tradition, that in my opinion, it depresses a greater development, which is what I would call orchestral development, and English composers who understand how to write for orchestra.
And that again, Leanne, requires immigrants. I mean, it requires outsiders to revitalize what that scene is. Charles Halley up in Manchester, and then those other European connections that are made. I mean, another of those moments, of course, in which all of these histories converge is what happens in the early 20th century. First World War, a really important part of that story too. But above all, the Second World War and before the Second World War, Leanne, in terms of the refugees, especially Jewish refugees, who make musical culture here and in whose debt so many of the institutions that we now take for granted still are.
That's absolutely right. I mean, Salomon, J.P. Salomon was Jewish. I don't think he came here because he was fleeing anything in particular. He came for the opportunity. And he came because he knew Haydn would make a very strong showing in London. So that's where the Salomon-Haydn connection comes in the late 18th century. But also, Mendelssohn himself was a converted Jew who was trying to cultivate music in every possible way. Jewishness is not necessarily a touch point of his musical identity. But Moscheles was also Jewish. Ludwig Berger, there are quite a few in the 19th century. They're happy to come because they know they are welcome. They know there is opportunity. They're not necessarily fleeing, but there were pogroms, particularly in Russia in the late 19th century and Poland. Those people did come to London, and sometimes the only thing they carried with them was their little violin in a case. So once you've got musicians who are coming in as players, they find opportunities in theater orchestras and other kind of commercial opportunities, and teaching. Teaching is absolutely essential to sustain a lifetime of work. But what you're speaking of, I think, are the diasporas and also particularly fleeing Nazism. And there we have such a, I want to say, rich harvest. It's not a good way to necessarily think always that it's to our advantage to take people from somewhere else. But what some of these Jewish immigrants brought is undeniably important for contemporary music, even now. Some were students of Schoenberg. Erwin Stein was the first writer who wrote about what we call the 12-tone style. He was a pupil of Schoenberg and came and stayed and made a career as a critic also. Hans Keller, you're familiar with as a refugee. He was a very young man at the time and stayed and developed and really becomes perfectly British in many ways. Egon Welisch, who ended up in Oxford, but had a terrific influence as a teacher. Matthias Seiber, who was a Hungarian and had worked with, studied under Kodai and brought so many wonderful traditions. He taught jazz in Frankfurt before he ever came to London. Then he ended up with Tippett at Morley College. So there's a real sort of flowing through. Albert Kalmus, you've probably played Kalmus Edition piano music, founded Universal Edition in London. And there's a whole list of these people. Walter Gurr also was a pupil of Schoenberg and conducted in Berlin, the radio orchestra. Then he became a director of Columbia Records and arranger at the BBC. So right through the highest institutions of this country came extremely competent Jewish immigrants.
Leanne, thank you. Listen, we got a huge amount there, and you know it's a revelation that the stories that connect, you know, the late 18th century to the mid 20th century, and then where we all are now, are all to do precisely with this these influences which we draw in, and which we're lucky enough, thanks to all of the historical coincidences and circumstances, you know, that have absolutely enriched not just London's musical life, but you know, this country's musical life, and therefore really, you know, the musical life of the world. Leanne, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.